Jake Martinez shifted in his chair and tried not to yawn. The conference room on Galactic Council Station Omega-7 was cold and smelled like recycled air mixed with alien cleaning chemicals. He sat in the back row wearing his best dress uniform, which still felt too tight around the collar after 3 years of military service. His job today was simple: stand around and look professional while the important people talked about important things. The Velkari, scientist Dr. Zethrin, stood at the front of the room, all 4 of his yellow eyes focused on the holographic display floating above the conference table. The creature shown in the projection was huge and terrifying. It looked like someone had mixed a giant cat with a lizard and then made it angry, very angry. The Shadow Maw represents the apex of evolutionary perfection, Dr. Zethrin said in his slow, careful way of speaking. His voice made Jake think of old trees creaking in the wind. For 10 million years, this species has dominated every ecosystem it encounters. No prey has ever escaped once marked for hunting. Jake watched the footage of the beast moving through a jungle. It was big, maybe 12 feet tall when it stood up on its back legs. Its skin changed colors like a chameleon, and it moved with the fluid grace of a predator that had never known failure. The recording showed it stalking a group of human colonists who had no idea death was following them. Observe its hunting methodology, the Velkari continued, pointing at the display with one of his long, thin fingers. The creature approaches from the optimal angle, utilizing wind patterns and terrain features with instinctive precision. Its movement is absolutely silent, its timing is flawless. Around the table sat representatives from a dozen different alien species. There were the tall, blue-skinned hegemony commanders with their military medals gleaming under the artificial lights. The Insectoid Confederation delegates clicked their mandibles in what Jake had learned was their version of nodding in agreement. Even the peaceful Sanctuary Union observers watched with obvious respect and fear. Jake tried to pay attention, but something about the footage bothered him. He had grown up hunting in the woods of Montana with his grandfather, and some things just looked wrong to him. The way the creature moved, the angles it chose, the timing of its approach, it all seemed inefficient somehow. The beast has killed 47 colonists across 3 worlds in the past 6 months, Dr. Zethrin continued. No tracking team has been able to locate it. No trap has been successful. Our best xenobiologists agree that the Shadow Maw represents an almost supernatural level of predatory intelligence. Jake bit his tongue. Supernatural was a strong word for what looked like basic hunting mistakes to him. The creature in the footage kept approaching its targets from downwind, which meant any prey animal with a decent sense of smell would detect it long before it got close. It also seemed to favor the same types of ambush spots over and over again, which was exactly the kind of pattern that good hunters learn to avoid. Furthermore, the scientist said, the creature appears to be expanding its territory at an unprecedented rate. Each attack occurs farther from the previous one, suggesting a level of strategic thinking we have never encountered in a non-sapient species. Commander Veltar of the Hegemony Fleet leaned forward in his chair. His species looked like humans. Might if they had evolved from sharks instead of apes, all sharp angles and cold eyes? What do you recommend, Doctor? Complete evacuation of the affected sectors, Dr. Zethrin replied without hesitation. We cannot match the hunting abilities of such a perfect predator. Our only option is to avoid it entirely. Jake could not help himself. He snorted quietly and shook his head. The sound carried farther in the quiet room than he had intended. Every eye in the conference room turned toward him. The attention felt like standing in front of a firing squad. Jake suddenly remembered why he usually kept his mouth shut during these important meetings. Dr. Zethrin's 4 eyes narrowed until they looked like angry yellow slits. Is there something amusing about the deaths of 47 sentient beings, human? Jake felt his face get hot. No, sir, nothing amusing about that at all. Then perhaps you would care to explain your reaction to our analysis. The smart thing would have been to apologize and sit back down. Jake had always been better at doing the right thing than the smart thing. Well, sir, it's just that the creature in those recordings isn't hunting very efficiently. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the hum of the life support systems. Several of the alien delegates made sounds that he was pretty sure translated to shock and disbelief. Efficiently? Dr. Zethran's voice went up an octave. Perhaps the primitive human believes it understands predation better than a creature that has survived 10 million years of evolution. Jake stood up slowly, knowing he was probably ending his military career, but unable to stop himself. Just saying, if I were hunting those colonists, I wouldn't telegraph my position by always attacking from downwind. That's basic stuff, sir? Any prey animal worth its salt would smell you coming from a mile away. The hegemony commander's shark-like face showed what might have been interest. Continue. And the ambush spots it chooses are too predictable, Jake sighed, warming to his subject despite the hostile stares. It keeps using the same type of terrain features, fallen logs, rocky overhangs, dense brush patches. After the first couple attacks, any halfway decent tracker would know exactly where to look for it. Dr. Zethran's skin began to change colors, cycling through what Jake had learned were various shades of alien anger. The human suggests that our most advanced tracking teams lack competence? I'm not suggesting anything about your tracking team, sir, Jake replied carefully. I'm just saying that from a hunting perspective, this creature has some pretty obvious weaknesses. Commander Veltar exchanged glances with the other military representatives around the table. Something passed between them that Jake could not interpret. The hegemony commander's cold smile showed rows of sharp teeth. Very well, human, Veltar said in a voice like grinding metal. Since you seem to understand this creature's weaknesses so clearly, you will have the opportunity to prove your claims. Jake felt his stomach drop toward his boots. Sir, you will track the Shadow Maw, the commander continued. Alone. If you succeed in locating and neutralizing the threat, it will demonstrate that human hunting methods have value. If you fail, he shrugged with elegant alien indifference. Dr. Zethran leaned back in his chair, his anger replaced by something that looked like satisfaction. An excellent proposal, Commander. When the human fails, it will prove once and for all that your species' arrogance far exceeds your primitive abilities. Jake looked around the room at the faces staring back at him. Some showed curiosity, others showed pity, but most showed the kind of cold calculation that meant they were already writing his obituary. He thought about his grandfather's voice teaching him to read animal tracks in the Montana snow, about the patient hours spent learning to move quietly through the forest, about the simple satisfaction of understanding how wild things thought and moved. All right then, Jake said, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. Guess I better pack some extra socks. Lieutenant Colonel Amy Rodriguez grabbed Jake by the arm the moment he stepped out of the conference room. Her grip was strong enough to leave bruises, and her dark eyes blazed with the kind of anger that usually preceded very loud shouting. Instead, she dragged him down 3 corridors and into an empty supply closet before she finally exploded. What the hell were you thinking in there, Martinez? She hissed, keeping her voice low but filling it with enough venom to kill a small planet. Did you just volunteer for a suicide mission because you got bored during a briefing? Jake leaned against a shelf full of cleaning supplies and tried to think of an answer that would not make things worse. Rodriguez had been his commanding officer for 2 years, and in that time she had kept him out of trouble more times than he could count. She was also the closest thing he had to family on this side of the galaxy. I wasn't volunteering for anything, he said finally. I just pointed out some things that seemed obvious to me. Obvious? Rodriguez ran both hands through her short black hair, which was what she always did when she was trying not to strangle someone. Jake, that thing has killed 47 people, 47, and you just told a room full of alien military commanders that you could do better than their best tracking teams. Maybe I can, Jake said, though he was starting to wonder if that was true. In the cold reality of the supply closet, his confidence from the conference room seemed like it might have been mostly stupidity. With what? Rodriguez demanded. They're giving you basic survival gear and that antique rifle your grandfather left you? No backup team, no extraction plan, no support of any kind. Hell, they're not even giving you decent communications equipment. Jake had seen the gear manifest on his way out of the briefing. One standard survival kit, one emergency beacon that would work for maybe 3 days if he was lucky, and his grandfather's old hunting rifle with exactly 50 rounds of ammunition. It was not exactly what most people would consider adequate. Equipment for hunting an apex predator on an alien world. The rifle's not an antique, he said weakly. It's a classic. Rodriguez stared at him for a long moment, then started laughing. It was not a happy sound. A classic. Jesus, Jake, you're going to get yourself killed with a classic rifle while trying to prove that humans are better hunters than creatures that have been perfecting the art of killing for 10 million years. Maybe, Jake admitted. But Rodriguez, I meant what I said in there. This thing isn't some mystical super predator. It's just an animal with patterns. All animals have patterns. And what if you're wrong? Jake thought about that for a minute. What if he was wrong? What if the Shadow Maw really was as perfect a hunter as the aliens believed? What if his grandfather's lessons about reading tracks and understanding animal behavior meant nothing when applied to something from another world entirely? Then I guess they get to say, "I told you so at my funeral," he said. Rodriguez shook her head and pulled out her datapad. Come on. If you're really going to do this insane thing, we might as well make sure you know what you're walking into. They spent the next 4 hours in the station's intelligence center, going over every piece of data the Galactic Council had collected about the Shadow Maw. Jake studied attack patterns, terrain maps, weather reports, and victim profiles until his eyes burned from staring at screens. Navigation Officer Pete Williams joined them after his shift ended. Pete was from Texas and had a slow, careful way of thinking about problems that Jake found reassuring. He spread star charts across the table and started marking locations with different colored pins. "Look at this," Pete said, pointing to the progression of attacks. "The aliens think this thing is moving randomly, but there's definitely a pattern here. Each attack is roughly 50 kilometers farther north than the last one." Jake studied the map. Pete was right. When you connected the attack sites in chronological order, they formed an almost straight line pointing toward the northern continent of the planet Epsilon Prime. "It's not randomly hunting," Jake said slowly, feeling pieces of a puzzle start to click together in his mind. "It's moving toward something specific. But what?" Rodriguez asked. "Don't know yet," Jake admitted. "But whatever it is, that's where I need to be." They worked until late into the station's artificial night cycle, planning routes and studying topographical data. The northern continent of Epsilon Prime was mostly wilderness, dense jungles broken up by mountain ranges and river systems. Perfect territory for something that wanted to stay hidden. Dr. Zethrin appeared just as Jake was loading his gear onto the transport ship. The Valkyrie scientist carried a datapad and wore an expression that managed to combine smugness with scientific curiosity. "Your movements will be monitored, human," he said, offering Jake the datapad. "This device will record your vital signs and location data. When you fail, the information will be valuable for our research into human overconfidence." Jake took the device and clipped it to his belt. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Doc. Really feeling the team spirit here. I have also taken the liberty of calculating the probability of your survival." Dr. Zethrin continued, apparently immune to sarcasm. "Based on the creature's hunting success rate and your species' documented physical limitations, I estimate you have approximately a 4.7% chance of surviving the first week." "What about the second week?" Jake asked. "There will be no second week." Jake shouldered his pack and picked up his grandfather's rifle. The weapon felt solid and familiar in his hands, like shaking hands with an old friend. "Well, Doc, I guess we'll find out." The transport ship was small and utilitarian, designed for moving cargo rather than passengers. Jake found a spot among the supply crates and tried to get comfortable for the 3-day journey to Epsilon Prime. The pilot was a gruff hegemony officer who made it clear that he considered the whole mission a waste of fuel. As the ship jumped to hyperspace, Jake closed his eyes and tried to remember everything his grandfather had taught him about hunting. The old man had been a tracker for the Montana Fish and Game Department for 30 years before Jake was born, and he had spent Jake's childhood passing on lessons learned from a lifetime of understanding how wild things thought and moved. Animals aren't mysterious, boy, his grandfather used to say while they followed deer trails through the mountains. They're just trying to stay alive and make more of themselves. If you can figure out what they need and where they're likely to find it, tracking becomes a lot easier. The Shadow Maw needed food, water, shelter, and probably territory. It was getting food from the colonists it killed, but 47 people spread across 6 months was not nearly enough to sustain something that large, which meant it was hunting. Other things too, things the council, investigators had not bothered to look for. Water would not be a problem on a planet like Epsilon Prime, which had extensive river systems and regular rainfall. Shelter could be caves, dense vegetation, or maybe even abandoned structures from previous colonial attempts. Territory was the interesting question. Most predators were territorial by nature, marking and defending areas that contained everything they needed to survive. If the Shadow Maw was expanding its territory in a specific direction, there had to be a reason. Jake opened his eyes and stared out the small porthole at the swirling colors of hyperspace. In 72 hours, he would be alone on an alien world, tracking something that had never been successfully hunted by anyone. The smart money said he would be dead within a week, but Jake had never been much good at playing it smart. He settled back against his pack and started planning how to prove that sometimes the old ways worked better than all the fancy technology in the galaxy. The ship hummed through hyperspace, carrying him toward what would either be the greatest triumph of his life or the most spectacular failure in human military history. Jake figured the odds were about 50-50, which was better than Dr. Zethrinus' estimate by a considerable margin. He closed his eyes and tried to get some sleep. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The transport ship dropped Jake on Epsilon Prime just after dawn on what the colonists had called Tuesday. The pilot did not even bother to shut down the engines, just opened the cargo bay door long enough for Jake to grab his gear and jump down onto the landing pad. Within 30 seconds, the ship was climbing back toward orbit, leaving Jake alone with the humid jungle air and the sound of alien birds calling from the trees. The abandoned colonial outpost looked like a place where hope had come to die. Half-finished buildings stood like broken teeth against the morning sky, their walls covered with vines and strange flowering plants that glowed faintly in the dim light. Equipment containers sat scattered around the clearing, most of them torn. Open and emptied by scavengers both human and otherwise, Jake spent his first day studying the attack sites within walking distance of the outpost. The Galactic Council investigators had marked each location with sensor beacons that beeped softly and projected holographic crime scene data into the air. The information was thorough and completely useless for tracking purposes. What the aliens had recorded as random predatory violence told a different story to Jake's trained eyes. At each site, he found signs that the investigators had missed or dismissed as unimportant. Scratches on tree bark at specific heights, patches of disturbed earth in geometric patterns, traces of a scent that reminded him of ozone and rotting. Flowers. The Shadow Maw was not just killing colonists, it was marking territory. On his second day, Jake followed a game trail that led away from the colonial area toward the dense jungle interior. The path was barely visible, just a slight depression in the undergrowth where generations of animals had worn a route between water sources and feeding grounds. The council scouts had dismissed such trails as irrelevant to their investigation, but Jake's grandfather had taught him that predators often use the same routes as their prey. 3 kilometers into the jungle, Jake found what he was looking for. The entrance to a cave system was hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The opening was just large enough for something the size of the Shadow Maw to squeeze through, and the ground around it showed clear signs of regular use. Jake knelt beside the cave mouth and studied the tracks pressed into the soft earth. The Shadow Maw's feet were enormous, nearly 2 feet long with 5 toes tipped by claws that left gouges in anything harder than mud. But more interesting than the size of the tracks was their age. Some were fresh, maybe a day old. Others had been there for weeks. This was not just a temporary shelter. The creature had been using this cave system regularly, probably as a highway between different parts of its territory. Jake pulled out his datapad and started mapping the tunnel entrances he could find. Within an hour, he had located 6 different openings spread across nearly 10 square kilometers, the old mining tunnels connected, like a subway system beneath the jungle floor. Colonial records showed that the original settlers had tried to extract valuable minerals from the area before abandoning the effort as unprofitable. What they had left behind was a perfect network of hidden passages that a smart predator could use to move unseen across vast distances. Jake spent his 3rd day learning the tunnel system, using his grandfather's flashlight to navigate passages that the Shadow Maw traveled in complete darkness. The creature's scent was stronger underground, and in several places he found evidence of recent meals, bones that had been cracked open for marrow, scraps of hide from animals he could not identify. It was in one of these feeding chambers that Jake found the first real surprise. Mixed in with the remains of various jungle creatures were pieces of technology, fragments of communication equipment, bits of colonial machinery, even what looked like parts of a Galactic Council sensor drone. The Shadow Maw was not just hunting living prey. It was actively collecting artificial objects. That night, Jake made camp in a tree about 2 kilometers from the main cave entrance. His grandfather had taught him that the best way to avoid dangerous animals was to sleep where they could not easily reach you. He tied himself to a sturdy branch 15 feet off the ground and tried to get comfortable in his sleeping bag. He woke before dawn to the sound of something large moving through the underbrush below his tree. Jake held perfectly still and listened as the creature passed directly beneath him, its footsteps almost silent despite its enormous size. Through the leaves he caught glimpses of dark scales that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The Shadow Maw paused at the base of Jake's tree and lifted its head toward where he was hidden. For a terrifying moment, Jake was certain he had been discovered. The creature's nostrils flared as it tested the air, and Jake could see intelligence burning in its yellow eyes. Then, apparently satisfied that no threat was present, it continued on its way toward the cave system. Jake waited until the sun was fully up before climbing down from his perch. The creature's tracks in the soft earth below his tree told a story that made his blood run cold. The Shadow Maw had not just passed by randomly. It had been following his scent trail from the previous day, tracking him just as deliberately as he was tracking it. The hunt had become mutual. Jake spent the morning studying the new tracks and trying to understand what he was dealing with. The Shadow Maw's behavior was more complex than anyone had realized. It was not just a mindless killing machine, but a thinking predator capable of learning and adapting to new situations. That afternoon, Jake positioned himself along what he had identified as the creature's most commonly used route between the cave system and the colonial area. He found a good hiding spot behind a fallen log and settled in to wait. Hunting required patience above all else, and Jake had learned patience from watching his grandfather spend entire days waiting for a single shot at a particularly clever buck. The Shadow Maw appeared just as the sun was setting, moving with the fluid grace of something that had never known fear. It was even larger than the holovids had made it appear, easily 12 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs to test the air. Its hide seemed to shift and change color as Jake watched, blending with the shadows until it was almost invisible. Even when he knew exactly where to look, Jake raised his grandfather's rifle and sighted carefully on the creature's center mass. The range was about 60 yards, an easy shot for someone who had been hunting since childhood. He took a slow breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's bark echoed through the jungle like thunder. The Shadow Maw spun with the impact of the bullet roaring with pain and rage. Jake had aimed for the heart, but the creature's movement at the last second had sent the bullet into its left shoulder instead. For a moment, predator and human stared at each other across the clearing. Jake could see surprise in the creature's yellow eyes, as if it had never conceived that something might actually hurt it. Then training took over, and Jake was already working the rifle's bolt and chambering a second round. The shadow maw did not give him a chance for another shot. It spun and vanished into the jungle with startling speed, crashing through the underbrush. Like a living avalanche, Jake followed the blood trail for 50 yards before losing it at the edge of a stream as darkness fell. Jake made his way back to his camp in the trees. His hands were shaking with adrenaline and his heart was still pounding from the encounter. For the first time in months, the apex predator of Epsilon Prime had been outmaneuvered by something it had tried to hunt. Jake settled into his sleeping bag and tried to process what had just happened. The shadow maw was wounded, but not badly. It would be more cautious now, more aware that it faced an opponent capable of fighting back. The creature would adapt its tactics, just as Jake would have to adapt his. What had started as a simple tracking mission was becoming something much more complex. Jake was no longer just hunting the shadow maw. He was engaged in a battle of wits with one of the most successful predators in the galaxy, and only one of them would walk away from the encounter. Jake checked his rifle and counted his remaining ammunition. 49 rounds left. He hoped that would be enough because he was beginning to suspect that this hunt was going to take longer than anyone had expected. In the distance, something roared with pain and fury. The sound echoed through the jungle, like a promise of violence to come. Jake smiled grimly and settled back to wait for morning. The real hunt was just beginning. The wounded shadow maw changed everything. Jake had expected the creature to become more cautious after their first encounter, but he had not anticipated how quickly it would learn. What followed was 2 weeks of the deadliest game of cat and mouse that Jake had ever experienced, with the roles of hunter and hunted switching back and forth like dancers in some violent ballet. The creature abandoned its predictable routes through the tunnel system and began moving across the surface in seemingly random patterns. It stopped using the same water sources twice and started making false trails that led to empty clearings or dangerous cliff edges. Most unsettling of all, it began hunting Jake as actively as he was hunting it. Jake found evidence of the creature's new behavior on his 4th day. He had been following what he thought was a fresh trail when he discovered his own boot prints from 2 days earlier. The shadow maw had been walking in his footsteps, using his own path to approach his camp from an unexpected direction. Only a last-minute decision to sleep in a different tree had saved him from becoming the hunted. Instead of the hunter, the realization that he was being stalked by something vastly more experienced at killing than he was at tracking should have been terrifying. Instead, Jake found himself oddly exhilarated. This was what his grandfather had called real hunting, the kind where both sides had everything to lose, and victory went to whoever made the fewest mistakes. Jake adapted his own tactics in response to the creature's learning. He started using techniques his grandfather had taught him for hunting the smartest and most dangerous game in Montana, the kind of animals that would remember your scent and hunt you if you gave them the chance. He changed his route every day, never approaching water sources directly, and began using noise discipline that would have made a military sniper proud. The shadow maw responded by becoming even more unpredictable. Jake would find its tracks leading toward the colonial ruins, only to discover that the creature had doubled back and spent the night watching his camp from a distance. He would set up carefully planned ambush along what seemed like obvious routes, only to have the creature appear from an entirely different direction. On the 7th day, Jake got his second clear shot. He had been tracking the creature through a series of rocky canyons when it suddenly appeared on a ledge about 80 yards away. The shadow maw was limping slightly from its shoulder wound, but it moved with the same fluid grace that had made it such a successful predator. Jake's bullet took it in the rear leg, spinning it around and sending it tumbling down the rocky slope. By the time Jake reached the spot where it had fallen, he found only blood on the stones and another trail leading deeper into the canyon system. The wound slowed the creature down but also made it more dangerous. A hurt predator was an unpredictable predator, and Jake began finding signs that the shadow maw was taking risks it would never have attempted while healthy. It started hunting during daylight hours and left more obvious tracks, as if it was deliberately trying to draw Jake into a confrontation. Jake spent 3 days studying the new pattern before he understood what was happening. The creature was not becoming reckless. It was preparing for something. Every trail led toward the same general area, a series of crystalline formations in the northern mountains that geological surveys had identified as containing rare mineral deposits. On the 11th day, Jake discovered what the Shadow Maw had been protecting. Hidden in a cave system within the crystal formations was a partially constructed nest, built from carefully arranged stones and decorated with the technological debris Jake had found in the creature's feeding chambers. The construction was elaborate and showed clear signs of intelligent planning. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Jake's mind. The Shadow Maw was not just expanding its territory randomly. It was a pregnant female preparing a nesting site for her offspring. The attacks on the colonies had not been simple predation but reconnaissance missions, testing the area for threats and gathering materials for nest construction. Jake studied the unfinished nest and tried to calculate how much time he had left. If the creature was preparing to lay eggs, it would become even more aggressive in defending its chosen territory. A mother protecting her young was the most dangerous thing in any ecosystem, human or alien. The final confrontation came on the 14th day, just as the sun was setting behind the crystal formations. Jake had positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the nesting cave, knowing that the wounded creature would have to return eventually. He had been waiting for 6 hours when the Shadow Maw finally appeared, moving carefully through the rocks. Below, the creature looked different now, its movements heavier and more deliberate. Jake could see the swelling in its abdomen that confirmed his suspicions about its condition. The Shadow Maw was not just protecting territory, it was protecting the future of its species. Jake raised his rifle and centered the crosshairs on the creature's vital area. At this range, with the creature moving slowly due to its injuries, it should have been an easy shot. His finger tightened on the trigger, then stopped. The Shadow Maw had paused beside its nest and was making low, rumbling sounds that Jake suddenly realized were not threatening. The creature was crooning to eggs that had not yet been laid, already showing maternal instincts toward offspring that existed only as potential. Jake lowered his rifle slightly and tried to think. He had been sent to eliminate a threat to colonial expansion, and the creature below him was certainly that. But it was also a pregnant female trying to ensure the survival of her species. Just like countless mothers throughout the galaxy, the moral complexity of the situation might have paralyzed someone else, but Jake's grandfather had taught him to think like the animals he hunted. The Shadow Maw was not evil or malicious. It was just trying to survive and reproduce in a universe that had suddenly become much more dangerous. The creature's head came up suddenly, nostrils flaring as it caught Jake's scent. For a moment, human and alien stared at each other across the crystal formations. Jake could see exhaustion in the creature's yellow eyes. Along with the desperate determination of a mother protecting her future young, the Shadow Maw charged up the slope toward Jake's position with shocking speed despite its injuries. Jake had time for one shot before the creature would be close enough to kill him with its claws. He raised the rifle, centered the crosshairs on the creature's chest, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet took the Shadow Maw high in the chest, stopping its charge and sending it rolling back down the slope. Jake worked the rifle's bolt and put a second shot into the creature's vital area, then a third to be certain. The apex predator of Epsilon Prime shuddered once and lay still among the crystal formations. Jake climbed down from his perch and approached the dead creature carefully. Even in death, the Shadow Maw was magnificent, a perfect fusion of evolutionary adaptation and predatory intelligence. Jake knelt beside the body and placed one hand on the creature's scaled hide, feeling oddly like he should apologize. His unit crackled to life for the first time in 2 weeks. Dr. Zethran's voice came through the static with obvious surprise. Sergeant Martinez, your vital signs indicate you are still alive. This is ... unexpected. Jake looked up at the alien stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Yeah, Doc, it's been a real adventure. The threat has been neutralized. Impossible, came the reply. Our projections indicated a 4.7% chance of survival. Jake smiled and shouldered his rifle. Well, I guess your projections didn't account for the fact that sometimes being primitive has its advantages. He spent the next hour collecting biological samples and documenting the nest site for the science teams that would inevitably follow. As he worked, Jake could not shake the feeling that he had learned something important about the nature of survival in a dangerous universe. The Shadow Maw had been a perfect predator, but perfection was a trap. It had become so specialized for one type of hunting that it could not adapt when faced with something genuinely new. Jake's supposedly primitive methods had succeeded, precisely because they were flexible enough to change when the situation demanded it. As the extraction team's lights appeared in the sky above, Jake took one last look at the dead creature. He had proven that humans belonged among the galactic community, but the victory felt more complicated than he had expected. Sometimes, winning meant making choices that no one should have to make. The extraction team arrived at dawn in a sleek Galactic Council transport that looked like it belonged in a museum compared to the battered cargo hauler that had dropped Jake off 2 weeks earlier. Dr. Zethrin emerged from the ship wearing full environmental protection gear and carrying enough scientific equipment to stock a small laboratory. "Where is the creature's body?" the Valkyrie scientist demanded without bothering with pleasantries. His 4 eyes darted around the crystal formations as if he expected the Shadow Maw to leap out from behind a rock and prove that Jake's success had been an elaborate hoax. Jake pointed toward the spot where the creature lay among the mineral deposits. "Right where I left it, Doc, though you might want to prepare yourself. It's bigger than the holovids made it look." Dr. Zethrin approached the dead Shadow Maw with the cautious steps of someone who had spent years studying dangerous things from a safe distance. When he saw the creature's actual size, his skin cycled through several shades of what Jake had learned indicated shock and disbelief. "Impossible," the scientist muttered, pulling out scanning equipment and beginning to take readings. The metabolic requirements for a creature of this size should have made it far. 3 months after returning from Epsilon Prime, Jake found himself standing in the Grand Assembly Hall of Galactic Council Station Omega 7, wearing his dress uniform and trying not to fidget while representatives from 17 different species debated the implementation of what they had started calling the Martinez Protocol. The hall was enormous, with curved walls that stretched up toward a domed ceiling, covered in stars from a dozen different homeworlds. Delegates sat in species-specific seating arrangements that accommodated everything from the aquatic depth swimmers in their water-filled tanks to the crystalline resonance singers, who communicated through harmonic vibrations. Commander Veltar of the Hegemony Fleet stood at the central podium, his shark-like features impassive as he addressed the assembly. "The human's methodology has proven effective against 12 additional problematic species across our territorial boundaries. Casualties have dropped by 73% in sectors where the Martinez Protocol has been implemented." Jake shifted his weight from one foot to the other and wished he could disappear. The attention made him uncomfortable, especially since he still was not entirely sure what the Martinez Protocol actually involved. As far as he could tell, it mostly consisted of asking tracking teams to think about why dangerous creatures did things, instead of just trying to kill them. Dr. Zethrin approached the podium with a data pad full of statistics and what Jake had learned to recognize as the Valkyrie equivalent of excitement. The psychological profile analysis has yielded unprecedented insights into predator behavior patterns. By understanding motivation rather than simply cataloging capabilities, our response teams have achieved resolution rates that exceed our most optimistic projections. The Confederation delegate, an insectoid creature whose name Jake could not pronounce, clicked her mandibles in what he hoped was approval. The human approach has proven particularly effective with the crystal weavers of Sector 7, traditional containment methods failed repeatedly, but understanding their territorial needs allowed for peaceful relocation. Jake tried to pay attention to the speeches, but his mind kept wandering back to the crystal formations on Epsilon Prime. 3 months later, he still woke up sometimes thinking about the Shadow Maw's yellow eyes and the nest she would never complete. Success felt more complicated when it came with that kind of weight. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez appeared at his elbow, looking almost as uncomfortable as Jake felt in her formal dress uniform. "How are you holding up, Martinez?" "Like a trained Monkey being shown off at the zoo, Jake whispered back. I just pointed out some obvious things about animal behavior. I don't understand why that's such a big deal. Because obvious to you isn't obvious to anyone else, Rodriguez replied. These people have been dealing with dangerous creatures using the same methods for centuries. You showed them a completely different way of thinking about the problem. Captain Lisa Barnes took the podium and began displaying holographic data about the various species that had been successfully managed using Jake's approach. The key insight was recognizing that aggressive behavior often stems from specific environmental needs rather than inherent hostility. By addressing those needs, we can eliminate threats without unnecessary violence. Jake found himself thinking about his grandfather, who had died 2 years before Jake joined the military. The old man would have gotten a kick out of seeing his simple hunting lessons being discussed by representatives of advanced alien civilizations. He also would have understood Jake's mixed feelings about the whole situation better than anyone else in the room. The debate continued for another hour before Commander Veltar called for the final vote. Jake watched with growing amazement as species after species formally approved the expansion of his tracking methods throughout Council space. What had started as an offhand comment during a boring briefing was becoming official policy for dealing with dangerous wildlife across multiple star systems. When the session finally ended, Dr. Zethrin approached Jake with an expression that managed to combine scientific curiosity with something that might have been respect. I wanted to apologize again for my initial assessment of your capabilities, Sergeant Martinez. Your species' intuitive approach to behavioral analysis has proven far more valuable than our technological methods. Jake shook the alien scientist's hand and tried to think of something appropriate to say. Thanks, Doc. I'm just glad it worked out. There is something else, Dr. Zethrin continued, pulling out a small crystalline device that glowed with soft blue light. The Council has decided to establish a new xenobiology research position. The role would involve training teams in your tracking methodology and developing protocols for peaceful resolution of creature conflicts. Jake stared at the device, which he assumed was some kind of official job offer. You want me to teach aliens how to hunt? We want you to teach us how to understand, the Velkari replied. There is a significant difference. The offer was tempting in ways Jake had not expected. He could travel to different worlds, work with species he had only heard about in briefings, and maybe find ways to solve problems without anyone having to die. It was the kind of opportunity that came along once in a lifetime. I appreciate the offer, Doc, but I think I need to go home for a while, Jake said finally. There are some things I need to figure out. Dr. Zethrin nodded as if he had expected that answer. The position will remain available if you change your mind. The galaxy has need of people who understand that wisdom can come in unexpected forms. Jake made his way through the crowd of departing delegates toward the observation deck, where Rodriguez was waiting for him. The view from the deck showed the curve of the station's hull against a backdrop of stars that included both Sol and dozens of other systems where humans were learning to make their place among the galactic community. So, Martinez, Rodriguez said as she joined him at the viewport, how does it feel to single-handedly change the galaxy's opinion of humanity? Jake watched a transport ship move slowly across the starfield and tried to come up with an honest answer. Honestly, Rodriguez, I just did what seemed obvious to me. The fact that it impressed a bunch of aliens says more about them than it does about me. Maybe, she replied. Oh, maybe it says something about the value of looking at old problems with fresh eyes. Jake thought about that as they stood in comfortable silence watching the stars. His grandfather had always said that the best hunters were the ones who never stopped learning, never stopped questioning their assumptions about how the world worked. Maybe that was humanity's real contribution to galactic civilization, not superior technology or advanced science. But the willingness to see familiar things in new ways. A year later, Jake's official report on the Shadowmaw incident would be required reading at military academies throughout Council space. The document, titled simply Basic Tracking Principles Applied to Xenofauna Management, would become one of the most frequently cited papers in the field of interspecies Conflict resolution. His grandfather's hunting rifle was eventually displayed in the Hall of Interspecies Cooperation with a plaque that read, "Proof that wisdom comes in many forms, and the oldest methods are sometimes the most effective." Jake visited the display once and decided that the old man would have approved of the sentiment, even if he would have laughed at all the formal ceremony surrounding it. On that evening, 3 months after Epsilon Prime, Jake was content to stand on the observation deck and watch the stars wheel slowly past the viewport. He had proven that humans belonged among the galactic community, but more importantly, he had learned that belonging was about more than just being accepted. It was about finding ways to contribute something valuable to the larger conversation about how different species could live together in a dangerous and complicated universe. Jake figured that was worth a few sleepless nights and the occasional bout of existential doubt. The stars looked the same as they always had, but somehow the galaxy felt like a slightly more hopeful place than it had been before. That was probably the best anyone could ask for from a single hunting trip, even one that had changed the course of interstellar diplomacy. Jake smiled and headed home to write a letter to his grandfather's grave. The old man deserved to know that his lessons about thinking like the animals you hunt had made it all the way to the stars.